When you imagine an apple in your mind, what exactly are you looking at? Because there's no light and there's no retinal stimulation, and yet you can see it. And today we're going to explore one of the deepest debates in cognitive psychology, which is your mind running code or is your mind running images? So, on one side of how your human mind works, we have the idea, there we go, that your human mind is running code. Much like a computer runs code, your mind is running code, and that is how we do the cognition that we are investigating in this course. On the other hand, it is also possible that your mind uses a different way of representing reality and representing ideas, and that is through images. So, an imagery representation will define exactly what that is the other possibility of what your mind is doing. And we're going to see that these two different ways of representing the external reality, cognition, of manipulating the symbols that we use in order to do cognition can have really, really profound effects and can get a little weird and a little woolly and a little wild and a little wonderful. And we are going to try to see if this might have some possible explanation for consciousness. So before we get to that, just a few ideas I want to introduce. So this is Benoit Mandelbrot, and he was a mathematician who is the father of the idea of fractals. So he was the one that actually coined that particular term, and he has a fractal that is named after him, which is the Mandelbrot set. And if you were to represent the Mandelbrot set as a series of propositions, a series of statements, if you were going to represent it in language, this is one possible way to represent what a Mandelbrot set is. So the Mandelbrot set is a two-dimensional set defined in the complex plane as a set of complex numbers C, for which the function fc of z equals z squared plus c does not diverge to infinity when iterated repeatedly starting at z equals 0. So we don't need to understand this to see that this is a propositional representation of the Mandelbrot set. It's a series of statements that defines what the Mandelbrot set is. On the other hand, you can represent the Mandelbrot set with an image. And this is what it looks like when you represent the exterior visually of this particular set. And this is what it looks like. And if you zoom in to the Mandelbrot set for higher and higher values of, I believe, Z, you get a recursive, reiterated copy of the Mandelbrot set. So it is self-recursive. The deeper you go, it does not change. It's just Mandelbrot sets all the way down. And you can do this ad infinitum, and it's always going to be the same basic structure. So keep that in mind. Keep that idea of recursion and being able to go into deeper levels, like in a fractal that is easily defined with propositions and then can also be displayed as imagery. Keep that in mind because we're going to try to tie that into another idea, which is the idea of the simulations of simulations. So I don't know if you have ever thought or heard of the argument about whether or not we live in reality or do we live in a simulation. So is this the real world or is this just fantasy? Is this a simulation of somebody simulating a world that we live in? So this is called the simulation hypothesis. And one of the best arguments that we actually do live in a simulated world comes from this theory. And I'm going to let Neil deGrasse Tyson and his co-host Chuck Nice explain it right now.
Here's the argument. Ready?
Go ahead.
Our computing power is growing rapidly. Right.
We create simulations of worlds. We have video games with characters that are inside the video game.
Right.
Imagine a day where you can simulate a world so perfectly with life forms, humans, so well that you can recreate every single neurosynaptic thought you could have, but now you're in the simulation on the computer.
So,
including the perception of free will.
well, there you have it. Because then, so now you would have enough computing power to imbue the Sims inside of the program with all of the human traits that we possess now.
Correct. Not only our human traits, but the world.
But the world.
The world itself.
Right.
And you don't have to have all the world existing there at all times.
Right.
That might be an unrealistic amount of computing power.
Right.
You just need
enough of the world that they see around them.
That they see around them.
Right.
So you want to start digging. And
that's so funny.
And haven't put the earth there. There's a flag that goes up in the programmer, and they say, need more earth. So they put earth beneath you while you can keep digging.
It's like the Truman Show.
Yeah, well, for example.
Right.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, does Minecraft, you can build
or
stuff?
Minecraft.
Right.
Oh, that is Minecraft.
Right. Okay.
God, that guy's a brilliant genius. Okay.
So, and we went to the moon. It's okay, let's make sure the moon is there.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe that's why we can't travel faster than the speed of light. Because if we could, we'd be able to get to another galaxy
before they could program
that galaxy. So much fun.
So the programmer put in that limit.
Put in the limit.
Because that's the fastest they can get.
We can't program fast enough. So we put in a limiter. The speed of light is a limiter so that you can't get to the next thing before we build it.
All right, so let me finish. That's good.
That's
good, Chuck.
All right.
So let me finish this. So now that world evolves and they develop computing power.
Right.
And they say, we want to play video games.
So now we're going to make a world.
So then they make a world and they have sufficient computing power that they invent to create a whole universe within their computers.
Okay.
And then
they make a world.
And then they make a world all the way on down.
Right.
It could be hundreds, thousands, billions, infinite.
All right. So far, this sounds like it still works.
That's fine. So now close your eyes, throw a dart. Which of these universes are you going to land in? The first one that's real or the gazillion that are not?
Well, yeah.
Just statistically. Okay.
Am I drinking when we're playing this darts game? Because.
All right. So before we get into the implications of this, I just want to say when they realized that the limit of light speed in our universe could be explained by the fact that it was programmed into our world as a limiter so that you couldn't outrun the programming. Kind of like if you've ever played any of those open world games and it's always kind of foggy in the distance because the computer hasn't rendered the backgrounds yet. That's something that happens in science all the time when you're developing a new theory and you find out, just as sort of conclusions and corollaries of it, that it explains so much other stuff. And it is truly like one of the most joyful kind of experiences you can have doing theoretical work. But the other idea is that if you have a real world that simulates another world, right? Let's say that they have the computing power and they can simulate another world, and then that world can simulate another world, and then that simulated world can simulate another world, and then that simulated world can simulate another world. Theoretically, you could have a nearly endless string of simulated worlds. And then if you woke up one day and thought to yourself, well, which world am I in? The chances that you're in that beginning world, the real world, is minuscule compared to all being in all of the other worlds. So let's just put easy numbers on it. There's one real world and there's 99 simulated worlds. You have a 99% chance that you are living in a simulated world rather than a 1% chance that you're living in that real world. Up the number of simulated worlds to 1,000, to 10,000, to 100,000, and the chances that we're actually living in this simulated world becomes more and more likely. And the weird thing about this is that once you actually start looking into it, not only do things like the speed of light make sense, but one of the things that would happen if we were living in a simulation was that we would actually be made up of bits of things, much like in computer code, there's bits that go into the code that describe everything that we're made of. So we would be made up of bits of things like atoms, like molecules. There would be a limit to how small you can go. So there is a lot of evidence that maybe we are living in this simulated world. But for our purposes today, the idea that you could have a simulation, and within that simulation, you can have another simulation. And within that simulation, you can have another simulation. And much like the Mandelbrot set, it can just go on and on and on and on. That is going to be one of the things that we're going to tackle today, because it is a extremely strange possibility that our reality is not the base layer of existence. But imagine instead that our minds, instead of figuring out, are we at the base level of existence? Imagine that our minds are simulating minds themselves, and those minds are simulating minds. So when you think, therefore you are, when you do that exercise, oh, I think, therefore I am, and you're aware that you're thinking, you could think of that as your mind simulated another mind to become aware of the fact that you're thinking. And if you're aware that you're aware of the fact that you're thinking, has your mind simulated another mind that is now aware of the fact that you're aware that you're thinking? So can it be that our minds have representations in them, much like these Mandelbrot sets? And you can zoom in forever. And this is the important part. This is why this is such a kind of nice example of it. You can zoom in forever, but it looks the same. It looks exactly like the same kind of mind. So we're going to take a look at that today and ask the question, a very basic question, if that was true, if this is maybe the solution to consciousness, what kind of representation would your mind need in order to be able to zoom in and zoom out of levels of your mind and have exactly the same structure in those levels? Would it be able to do that with a language like code, or would it need something more like images? So we are going to take a look at that. And that is a cognitive psychology question, not the question about consciousness, but it is a question of, do we use language like code in our minds, or do we use something more like images? That's been something that cognitive psychology has been arguing for about 60 years. So today we're going to take a look at one of the most famous studies that contributed to that argument, to that evidence. So we're going to introduce first the idea of imagery versus propositional representations. And then we're going to take a look at the Cog Lab on mental rotation and compare it to what Shepard and Metzler found in their 1971 study. And then we're going to see if we can apply this to the idea or the theory of whether consciousness, our experience of being aware of our world, is a simulation. Because as we've seen so far in our discussions of attention, of ecological perception, of image perception, there is at no point was consciousness required. At no point did you need to be conscious of what you were doing in order to be able to do the particular behavior. Consciousness has not come up as a theoretical construct anywhere. So could we maybe get at it? The big mystery of psychology, why do we have consciousness and what is it exactly? Could we get at it through imagery versus propositional representations? Well, we'll see that today. All right, so just kind of rewind back to one of our first meetings here to be very clear about what we're talking about. What is a representation? So once again, we have an external reality, or maybe a simulated external reality, but we'll forget about the simulation hypothesis for right now. We have an external reality out there, and we represent it in our minds with internal symbols. And those internal symbols are what we manipulate, what we use in order to do cognition. But the key here is that they have different possible forms. There are different types of symbols that can stand for the same thing. So, for example, you might represent the external reality of the United States and its layout of cities with a internal symbol that looks a lot like an image, looks a lot like a map of the United States. Or you could represent the layout of cities in the United States with just a series of statements. Los Angeles to New York, they're 2,790 miles apart. New York to Dallas, 1,547 miles apart. Dallas to Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. You would need an extensive list. So you can have different ways of representing the same external reality, but with different internal symbols. Now, one thing just to be absolutely clear about this, we are not talking about internal symbols in your brain. So we're not talking about neurons. We're not suggesting at all that you have a map in your brain, that if you're thinking about the layout of the United States and somebody was to freeze your brain and then slice it open, that they would see a map in there somewhere. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about level 3 of Mars tri-level hypothesis, where we tried to figure out how does your brain and the environment implement these symbols. We're talking about level 2, which is what representations are being used. So don't worry about the implementation of it. Leave that to neuroscience for now, but just start thinking about what would happen if we used internal symbols that looked like external reality versus what would happen if we used internal symbols that represented external reality but did not look like external reality. So let's get a little bit more formally defined on this. What we're talking about here is we're talking about the difference between propositional representations and imagery representations. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say that imagery, the word imagery in imagery representation means a very specific thing. It does not necessarily mean picture, right? So it can mean a picture, but it does not necessarily mean a picture. What it actually means is very specific to this idea of imagery representation, so don't let that confuse you. So what do we mean when we're talking about propositional versus imagery? Propositional representation, they are lists of propositions. They are lists of statements. So just a whole, almost like shopping list of statements that represent the external reality. Importantly, they do not preserve structure. So if I gave you a list of propositions like this: Caucasian female with long dark hair, hands folded on lap, mysterious smile. If I kept going with those propositions and gave you enough detail, you would be able to represent the image of the Mona Lisa with just propositional representations, right? You would be able to give enough information where people would say, oh yeah, that's the Mona Lisa. I know that, that external reality. I know what you are representing with this series of statements. So that's a propositional representation. That's one way to represent the Mona Lisa. On the other hand, we got imagery representations. And imagery representations, they're not necessarily pictures. They include pictures, but they are representations that do preserve the structure. So this is an imagery representation of the Mona Lisa, and we'll put her up beside the propositional representation of the Mona Lisa. And the imagery representation on the right, that's not the Mona Lisa. That's not the painting that's hanging in the Louvre. And the painting is a representation of, I don't know if she really existed, but of the person that Da Vinci would have been painting. So this is a representation, imagery representation of the Mona Lisa, and it preserves structure. And what that means is that the properties of the image map onto the physical external properties of the thing being represented. So for example, her eyes are above her mouth in the imagery representation. Her eyes are above her mouth in the actual painting. That structure is preserved. Her hair is darker than her face in the imagery representation. In the actual Mona Lisa, her hair is darker than her face. That structure is preserved. But when you take a look at the propositional structure, we have long dark hair, we have mysterious smile, but the words long dark hair are no darker than mysterious smile. So that structure has been lost. So an imagery representation, the key definition is that the actual representation somehow, in some way, maintains the structure of the thing that is actually representing. So it's like a mini copy, almost, you can think of it that way, of what it is that you are trying to represent. All right, so imagery representation, they're representations that preserve structure, and they're not just visual. So you can have imagery representations of any form of external reality. It just depends upon what properties of the structure are you preserving. So one non-imagery example of this is sound. So sound is an external reality. Sound exists in the external world, and it can be represented in different ways. So you can represent sound as a series of propositions. And you can say that the sound that this person is making in their recording studio, they had a 500 hertz tone at 20 decibels for 200 milliseconds. And then that is followed up with a 300 hertz tone at 15, supposed to be decibels, for 100 milliseconds. And then that's followed up by a 200 hertz tone at 10 decibels for 200 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. You need a lot of propositions, but you can represent a sound in terms of just these amounts. What pitches it, how loud is it, and how long does it last for? You can represent sound using these propositional statements. That's a propositional representation. Doesn't preserve any of the structure. This, on the other hand, is an imagery representation. And in this case, we haven't preserved the sound. This doesn't sound like a sound, but part of the structure of a sound is the amplitude of the sound wave. So how high is that sound wave? Part of a structure of a sound is how close together the sound waves are. So a deep sound has very long sound waves. A high sound has very short sound waves. And the distance between the peaks of this sound wave here preserves that structure. So the peaks with further distance, those are lower notes. The peaks with closer distance between them, those are higher notes. The peaks that are actually taller, those are louder sounds. The peaks that are not as tall, those are softer sounds. So it preserves the structure of a sound wave, in this case, in a visual representation of it. But the key part of this that makes it an imagery representation is that it does preserve some of that structure. This does not preserve any of the structure of a sound. This does, even though it's not a sound, right? It's an image, but that image represents the sound and it preserves that structure of the sound. So propositional representations are one way of representing sound. And if you have ever listened to digital music, then you have listened to sounds that have been represented as propositional representations. So computer code is a propositional representation. It's just a series of statements. It's a series of zeros and ones. So if you've streamed any song lately, you have experienced a propositional representation reproducing the sound of that particular song. On the other hand, you have been enjoying sound and songs represented by imagery representations if, on the other hand, you listen to vinyl records. So if there are some audiophiles here or some music purists, a vinyl record is a imagery representation of sound. So we know the sound is represented on the record because you can put it in a record player and it can reproduce the sound. So the representation of that sound has to be in there. But if you take a look at a record under an electron microscope, what you'll see is all of the little grooves. They have these little bumps and they have these little wiggles in them. And those wiggles represent the sound wave. So the bigger the wiggle, the louder the sound. The closer together the wiggles, the higher the sound. The further apart the wiggles, the lower the sound. And this is another close-up microscopic image of a record needle going through those grooves. And the grooves move the needle back and forth, and that gets picked up by the speaker, and that's what produces the sound. But this is an imagery representation because the grooves in the record, let's go even closer in there, the grooves in the record preserve the structure of the actual sound that it is then producing. So the space between the grooves, the space between the peaks preserves the structure of the space between the amplitudes of the sound wave. The size of the grooves preserves the structure of the height of the sound wave in terms of loudness. The structure is preserved. So, one of the big sort of questions that anchored this debate is, well, what sort of representation do we actually use? So what sort of representation do we use when we do cognition? Do we use things that are like a record player in our mind, or a record in our mind that actually preserves the structure of sound? Or do we just have a series of propositions that can then represent that series of sounds? And one of the kind of ideas is that we might have become so good at cognition. Our minds are such efficient cognitive machines that kind of trying to introspect which one of these do we use actually doesn't work. Because once you can think of it as this, once your mind is so good at running code, it might not actually even interpret it as code anymore. It might interpret it just as imagery, just as what is being produced by the code. So my favorite example of this, I'm going back to the Matrix one more time. My favorite example of this is when Neo first gets into the real world and sees the Matrix in propositional form, and he's talking to Cypher, and Cypher has a very interesting insight in terms of how a proposition can mask itself as an image.
Is that
The Matrix? Yeah.
do you always look at it and code it?
Well, you have to. The image translators work for the construct program. But there's way too much information to decode the Matrix. You get used to it. I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead.
Okay, so he's gotten so good at reading the representations, reading these propositional representations. It's just a series of symbols. That's a propositional representation. But he's gotten so good at reading that he doesn't even see the code. All he sees is blonde, brunette, redhead. So it might be that our minds are doing the same thing. It might be that we can no longer see the code that our minds are running. We can't introspect and think to ourselves, well, wait a second, am I using propositions or am I using imagery? We might only see blonde, brunette, redhead because the code is running underneath our level of awareness. So we might have images in our mind and we might think that we use them, but it might all just be underlying propositional code that is doing the real work. All right, let's keep going. So why is this important? Other than we just really, really want to know how our minds work. Well, the reason that this is one of the big fundamental questions of how our minds operate is because it has real implications in terms of our behavior and understanding what we do as human beings. So the reason for this is because sometimes imagery representations are more useful, and then other times propositional representations are more useful. So let's start with imagery representations. Imagery representations are oftentimes more useful when you're actually dealing with visual external reality that you're trying to represent. So we have that in our English vernacular. People say, hey, a picture's worth 1,000 words. It's actually worth way more than 1,000 words. It would be, imagine how many words you would need to give a sketch artist who has never seen the Mona Lisa so that they draw the Mona Lisa. It's going to be way more than 1,000 words. So sometimes imagery representations would be more useful. Specifically, a picture of the Mona Lisa is way better at helping people understand what Mona Lisa looks like than a series of propositions. On the other hand, sometimes propositional representations are more useful. And we touched on this a little bit when we were looking at metaphors. This is more for linguistic metaphors. And as it turns out, some metaphors work better and are more understandable and can communicate their metaphor better in linguistic propositional form than they can in imagery form. So, for example, if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, you know what? I just met this new guy and he's really great." You're like, "Oh, yeah, well, tell me more about him." And they say, "You know, my boyfriend is a knight in shining armor." There should be a K in there. So, my boyfriend is a knight in shining armor. You know what they mean, but it's very hard to represent that in imagery. So if they said, "Well, describe your boyfriend, what's he like?" And they said, "Well, hey, I put together this image of him. There he is right there." You're not going to get the metaphor from this imagery representation, right? My boyfriend is a knight in shining armor. You understand what that means. Imagery of the boyfriend in shining armor means something completely different. So what they actually mean is that the boyfriend is very noble, the boyfriend is very kind, the boyfriend is heroic, the boyfriend does nice things for them, the boyfriend acts in this chivalrous manner. Basically, the boyfriend is gallant and he's not goofus. So I'm going to take you down a little bit of a historical route right now. So has anybody ever seen Goofus and Gallant before? This is like way before, I think this was like done probably like in the 70s, but these are little inserts that would appear in children's magazines. It was a children's comic strip that appeared monthly in highlights for children. And what it was a way of teaching children, mostly young boys, what is the proper way to act. How can you be a knight in shining armor? So when we say that somebody is a knight in shining armor, what we mean is that they don't act like Goofus on the side there. So you see the two boys playing and they broke the wagon and Goofus says, "It doesn't matter. It's not my wagon." And little children were taught that's bad. You don't want to be like Goofus. You want to be like Gallant on the right side there going, "We must be careful. This is not my wagon." So you have respect for other people's belongings. It also, my boyfriend is a knight in shining armor means that he's not like Goofus on the side there. Goofus is rude to the woman who helps. They're more like Gallant on the right there. It's nice you help keep the house tidy. So that's what is meant by my boyfriend is a knight in shining armor. But when I was looking for these examples, one came up, and this was from, I couldn't find the original highlights magazine that it came out of, but it was from a report in the Atlantic Monthly. And the Atlantic Monthly has been a publication since like 1857. That was its first issue. So I'm going to give them a little bit of the doubt here that they know how to report factually. They've been around for 150, 170 years. So they did this article on the evolution of American parenting. And the example that they used just shocked me. And if you ever wonder why in our society, men often have trouble expressing emotions and processing emotions and just dealing with emotions in an honest and real way. Part of it is the socialization that occurs in our society. And this is about the worst example of this I've ever seen. So on the left, we have Goofus. And remember, Goofus is the bad one. Goofus is what we don't do. So when Goofus falls and skins his hands and knees, he cries like a baby. And Gallant, our hero, the one that we're supposed to be like, Gallant gets up smiling, even if blood is seeping from his knees. So this is what was being taught to little boys in 1955. So if you know somebody who was between the ages of 5 and 10 in 1955 and they are still around and they are closed off and don't express their emotions very well, just know that they were being programmed since they were children to do that. And incidentally, the left side there, that is the appropriate response, right? When you skin your hands and knees and you're a child, yeah, you cry like a baby. Gallant there, that is step one to becoming a serial killer. I'm not joking. Like, watch out for pets in his neighborhood because Gallant is on a bad spiral. Anyways, that was just my aside there. So, other examples of metaphors where the propositional representation is more useful. So, just to be equal opportunity here, we have the metaphor, my girlfriend is a fox. And again, very difficult to represent this in an imagery representation. If somebody said, my girlfriend is a fox, and you say, oh, really? Well, show me a photo. You're not expecting this, right? This is not what it's hard to get an imagery representation of it. If somebody said my girlfriend is a fox, you're expecting something more like this. And if you remember our previous discussion on pictorial metaphors and you recognize who that is, you'll know that this is now literal with a metaphor stacked on top, with more literal stacked on top. So we're stacking representations on top of each other. All right. So the big thing that we don't want to deny is that we actually do have visual imagery. So if I ask you, picture an apple in your mind, and you can picture an apple in your mind, that is visual imagery. So we're not questioning whether or not we have visual imagery. There actually is a condition known as aphantasia, which is the inability to visualize. So there are people going around with cognition that can do cognition, but just can't visualize. So if you ask a typical individual, imagine an apple in your mind, they'll have an internal experience that looks more like condition 1 over there. If you ask somebody with severe aphantasia to imagine an apple in their mind, they'll have the experience of condition 5 over there. So visual imagery, the ability to imagine things in your mind. If you think of your favorite song and you can hear it in your mind, that's also imagery. But we know that we have imagery in our minds. So we have visual imagery. But the question is, do we actually use it for cognition? Do we actually make use of this visual or auditory image that we have in our mind? Or possibly, is it just an extra experience? And the fancy word for that is it epiphenomenal? So you can think of epiphenomenal as features or conditions that exist, but exist as a byproduct or do not actually contribute to the phenomenon at hand. So my favorite example, I used to live next door to my neighbor. He was obsessed with motorcycles and he liked the street motorcycles and not the custom ones. He liked street ones. And we had a joke that the more R's that you had in a motorcycle's name, the faster the motorcycle went. So this is a Suzuki GSX R1000. So that's a pretty fast motorcycle. It has 1 R. This, and I kid you not, is the Honda CBR 1000 RR-R Fireblade SP. It has tons of R's, but the R's don't make it go faster, right? R's are epiphenomenal. They're not actually doing any work. They will put extra R's on the faster motorcycles because if you get 2 R's next to each other, usually that stands for race replica. So there's street legal race replicas of motorcycles, but it doesn't actually go faster. And that's easy to prove. Take some R's, slap it on an old beat up motorcycle, and you're not going to improve its speed. So that's what we mean by epiphenomenal. So the question here, and let's try to think of this a little bit. Do we think that imagery in our minds actually helps thinking? And can we think of any possible likely examples that allow us to, where imagery would allow us to think better. So any speculations off the top of your head? All right, so let me give you a concrete example. Let's say that you park somewhere in a parking garage, and you're trying to remember where you parked your car. What kind of code do you think you're running? Do you remember a sentence, or do you replay a visual scene? So hands up if you find it easier. Let's try this. Hands up if you find it easier. You go into a parking garage and you look at the level and you say, all right, I am in level P3. And then you say to yourself, okay, P3, P3, P3. So how many people would think that P3 would be better? And then how many people, when they go to a parking garage and they see the picture of the piano, and then you go up another level and you see the picture of the violin, and then you go up another level and you see the picture of the guitar, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm on mental image guitar level. How many people would find P3 easier? Hands up. How many people would find guitar level easier? Hands up. Okay, so in this case, this would be an example where imagery, for most of us, would not actually help us do cognition. Times when imagery might help you do cognition is if you're trying to do some sort of mental navigation. So if somebody is describing how to get somewhere on a route, you might actually try to imagine, I take a right turn, I take a left turn, and then I go straight until I hit the lights. You might actually try to imagine that and represent it visually. On the other hand, you might just remember exactly what I just said. I take a left turn, I take a right turn, I go straight until I hit the lights. So it really is difficult to tease out whether or not we're using propositions or whether or not we're using mental imagery. And that is what we're going to be looking at when we take a look at that cog lab. That is what mental rotation experiments were designed to test. So just to kind of nail this home, if visual imagery is an imagery representation, so if the imagery in our minds, if our cognition is actually represented by an imagery representation, so not just our experience of it, but the actual representation preserves that structure, it's going to preserve that structure. It's going to be in our minds like grooves in a record where it's not sound, but it looks like sound. It's not the sound wave, but it preserves the structure of the sound wave. If we have that type of imagery representation and it preserves structure in our minds, and then if structure determines performance in the real world, then similar performance patterns should be seen when you're using visual imagery. So again, if the imagery preserves the structure and that structure in the external world determines performance in the external world, then if we preserve that structure, we should see the same types of performance patterns when we use visual imagery. So for example, one thing that any audiophile will tell you, anybody that is really into vinyl records, one thing that you do not do to a vinyl record is play the same side twice in a row. So if you were to play side A of a record and then you thought to yourself, man, I love that so much, I'm just going to play side A again, you're going to start deteriorating the record, because what you've done is the needle, the first time it's gone through the grooves, has actually physically warmed up your vinyl. And then if you put it through those warmed up grooves a second time, it actually smooths out the grooves. So you're going to lose fidelity. It's going to sound more like hisses. You're going to introduce noise. On the other hand, if you have digital media, you can play that over and over and over and over again with no loss of quality. So that would be an implication in our performance, because let's say that we're trying to remember what a song sounds like, and we try to remember it again and again and again and again and again. If we have a propositional representation, our remembering of that song will not deteriorate. We could remember it over and over and over again with no deterioration. If we have a more imagery based representation of that song, then as we remember it over and over and over again, we might be wearing out the grooves of our memory. And after trying to remember a song for 10 years, you finally hear it on the radio and you think to yourself, well, that's not at all what that sounded like in my head. That's not what I remember it sounding like. So it would mimic the performance of the real world, and tests like mental rotation that we did in the Cog Lab is exactly trying to set up a situation like that. Incidentally, when we do get to memories, if we get a chance, we will talk about reconstructive memories. And every single time, this is just one of the cruelties of your mind. Every single time you remember something, you make it vulnerable to reinterpretation and you make it vulnerable to errors. So every time you bring a memory to consciousness, it becomes almost, it's like a groundhog sticking its head out of the plane and looking around. It's in danger. And until you kind of recode it back in, it's vulnerable. And if you recode it and you recode some extra stuff in it, you're going to get what we're going to see later, which is false memories. All right, but mental rotation. Let's see if we can figure out, for visual imagery in our minds, do we actually use that image to do cognition? So in the mental rotation Cog Lab, we have two 3D blocks. Shapes were shown on the screen, and your task was to just determine whether the two shapes were the same or different. And we had independent variable, the degree of rotation in depth. So the blocks were either rotated 0 degrees in depth, 20 degrees, 40 degrees, all the way up to 120 degrees. So what that means is that they were rotated in depth. So they weren't rotated in the actual picture plane. They were rotated going into the picture plane, going away from you. And you would need to take a look at two pictures of these blocks and determine, are they the same, or determine, are they actually different? And that was your task, indicating if these were the same objects. So these two here are the same. They just differ in their orientation by rotation. These two here are actually different. They are two completely different physical objects if they existed in the real world. And this is a replication of work that was done in 1971 by Shepard and Metzler. And they had two images, and they simply looked at how long does it take for subjects to determine if they're the same object, and importantly, as a function of rotation. So they would put up two objects like this, or two objects like this, and your job was just to indicate, are those two objects the same? They just differ by rotation, or are they two different objects? So what are some of the ways that your mind might solve this? Because this was designed to test between propositional representations and imagery representations. So let's take a look at a propositional representation strategy that can solve this problem. So it is quite possible that in your mind, what you're actually doing when you're trying to solve this problem here is you say to yourself, all right, let's take a look at the one on the left side there, and let's code it as a series of statements. So starting from the bottom, on that left side, we got 3 cubes. So we got 1 cube, another cube, and a third cube. And then we take a 90-degree turn and we add 3 cubes, 1, 2, 3. And then we take another 90-degree turn and we add 2 cubes. And then we take a final 90-degree turn and we add 2 cubes. Now, if you wanted to get an actual complete propositional description of this, it would need to be longer because you need to know the direction of the 90-degree turn. But for our purposes, this is sufficient. Left side coded as a proposition: 3 cubes, 90-degree turn, 3 cubes, 90-degree turn, 2 cubes, 90-degree turn, 2 cubes. And then you encode the right side. And you say to yourself, all right, what does the right side have? Well, it's got 3 cubes. So you compare that to the left side and you're like, check. So far, so good. It's got a 90-degree turn. Compare the right side to the left side. Check. So far, so good. 3 cubes. Check. 90 degrees. Check. 2 cubes. Check. 90 degrees. Check. 2 cubes. These are the same objects. So in a propositional representation, you could determine that they're the same objects just by going through a propositional statement description of all of these, of the two objects. On the other hand, if you were using visual imagery representations, if these were actually the representations that were doing work. So once again, we have to remember the fact that your brain is incredibly good at using representations. So you might have it represented like this in propositional form, but much like Cypher, all you see is blonde, brunette, redhead, funny shaped hook, funny shaped squiggly thing. So it's not that we don't have these imagery representations, but are they doing the work? Well, if they are doing the work, this is one way that they might do that work. So you represent the left side with an imagery representation of the shape. So you actually have an image that preserves the structure of that left side object. And then you have on your right side another imagery representation of the shape that actually preserves the structure, and in this case, orientation of that right side object. And then what you do is you actually take that, for example, right side representation, and in your mind, you rotate it. And you rotate it and you rotate it and you rotate it until they line up. And you say to yourself, well, those two images now look exactly the same. So we are dealing with the same objects. So that is the way to do a visual representation solution to this problem. All right, so far so good? Okay, so what's going to happen in this case? Well, for the propositional representation, regardless of the degree of rotation, you're just going through a list. You're just going 3 cubes, 90 degrees, 3 cubes, 90 degrees, 2 cubes, 90 degrees, 2 cubes. You're just going through your list. So on average, regardless of how rotated they are, it should take the same average time, regardless of your rotation. Basically, you would stop as soon as you get to that first disagreement. So if it's like 3 cubes, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 3 cubes, 2 cubes, you'd be like, oh, no, those two are two different things. So sometimes it might get disqualified on the first proposition. Sometimes it might only get disqualified on the last proposition. Sometimes they might match up. But importantly, it's going to be the same average time regardless of rotation, because rotation is not in the proposition representation. It's not necessary to be there because we're not preserving that structure. In a visual imagery representation, we preserve the structure. And if we're preserving the structure and we actually have the same consequences for our cognition that the structure would have in the real world, well, it takes time to rotate something in the real world. It takes time to rotate it the further you have to rotate it. So if our minds are using imagery representations, then we should see increased time as the rotation necessary to match it up increases. So that is the pattern of results we should see. If imagery representation is preserving that structure of rotation difference, then because it takes time to rotate things in the real world, it's going to take time to rotate the same things in our mind, and our solution to this problem should take longer the further we have to rotate things. All right, so that is the setup. Let's see what they actually found. So what were the results for the same shape trials? We're going to do those first. So these are the ones where the two objects were exactly the same. They just differed in how much they rotate. So there on the x-axis, we have the rotation degrees. That's the difference in rotation between the two objects. So 0 degrees, they were not differently rotated at all. 120 degrees was the maximum amount of rotation. And then we have your reaction time in milliseconds, and it goes anywhere from 1600 milliseconds, so about a second and a half, all the way up to 2800, so approximately 3 seconds. So somewhere between a second and a half to 3 seconds is how long it takes you to compute this. And what we found was that as a function of rotation, the amount of processing time increased as the rotation required increase. So at 0 degrees of rotation, you can see we were at about 1650 milliseconds. That's about as fast as your eyes can process what's on the screen and your finger can press the button. That's what that's measuring right there, because you didn't actually have to do any rotational work. And then as it goes up, you can see that as the rotation increases, the amount of time you need to process it, as shown by your reaction time, similarly increases. And if you compare this to what Shepard and Metzler found back in 1971, the results are nearly identical. And I say nearly identical because it always kind of strikes me when I look at this that Shepard and Metzler's results are basically a linear function. It's basically a straight line. Straight line fits that incredibly well. Our results is more of an asymptotic line. It kind of seems like it's kind of flattening out there at the top. And I just wonder if the amount of visual processing that we have to do in our society today, because we live in a way more visual world, kind of contributes to that, where we can sort of get faster rotation as we get into the higher rotations than they were able to do in 1971. That's just speculation on my part, but it always strikes me like their line is just straight. Our line is not so much. All right, so those are the same trials. The further you needed to rotate, the longer it took. What about the different trials? So once again, we have the same graph. Let's put those same trials up there. So when the two objects matched, increased processing time as rotation increased. When the two objects did not match, when they were different objects, those are the results right there. You have the same processing time as rotation increased. And I would love to compare this to what Shepard and Metzler did back in 1971, but they did not actually publish their different trials. So I have a theory on that, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. But if you are looking at the original report, they didn't report their different trials. But importantly, our different trials, same amount of reaction time, regardless of rotation. You were just as fast when these different objects were rotated 120 degrees as you were when they were rotated 0 degrees. All right. So Shepard and Metzler, their results provided very strong evidence, not conclusive because it's still argued about, but very strong evidence that we are actually using visual imagery representations, because as the rotation increased, your reaction time increased. So the amount of time you needed to process the rotation was a function of how large the rotation was. That is a pattern that we see in the physical world because of the structure of the physical world. The fact that we see the same pattern in our behavior indicates that our minds are using representations that preserve the structure of the physical world that's causing that pattern of behavior, preserving the structure, imagery rotation. All right, so is the pattern of results for different shape trials more consistent with imagery or propositional representations? And what strategy is your mind using? So for the different shaped trials where the two objects were different, what does that flat line indicate to you? What's some of your speculations in terms of what you were doing when you were doing this particular cog lab?
For the same, I had just like been rotating in basically in my head, and eventually I would notice, okay, those are insane, just quit. But for the different ones, I would try to rotate in my head first, realize this isn't really working out, and then try and just basically like count cubes and see where they rotate.
Oh, okay. So you tried an imagery representation first, and then if it didn't work out, you then tried a propositional way of solving it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, so that would lead to the exact same pattern that we're seeing here. That was a flat line, because regardless of how far, regardless of how rotated it actually was, you said that you tried to rotate it for a little bit, and then you went to a propositional representation. Did anybody else do something like that? Yeah, you did the same, where you tried an imagery solution where you rotated it and then you stack a proposition on top of it. Anyone else? Does anybody, do you remember how far you tended to rotate it before you were like, well, let me just go to proposition?
Say like the max would be like 90 degrees, probably.
Okay. And would you
Probably 180.
180? Okay. It would be interesting if you have access to your individual data in your cog labs. Take a look at your individual data, because your two strategies actually have very different implications. So the reason that I asked is because if you take a look at that data point there, that's where the time required for different trials matches up with the same trials. And what that would indicate, to a possibility that would indicate, is that on the same trials, you rotate something until it matches, as you were saying, and then you're like, oh, okay, it matches, I'm done. So if you have to rotate it 40 degrees, that might not take very long. That's why the reaction time is low on 40. If you have to rotate it 120 degrees, that's going to take the maximum time. That was the maximum amount of rotation in this particular study. On the different trials, none of us were sort of just rotating it 20 degrees and then giving up, right? You try harder on the different trials. You go the full rotation. And what this results kind of here indicate is that you try the full rotation before you give up, right? You try to go the full 120 degrees before you say, you know what? No, it's not the same. And that's one possible reason why the 120-degree uh, rotation has the same reaction time, whether it's different or whether it's same. Interestingly, for your example, if you quit at 90 and you see the same pattern here, what that means is that you would have quit on your different trials right around there, which is about 2,500 milliseconds. And then if you added to that your propositional representation, you could actually figure out how long it takes you to solve it with a propositional representation by taking a look at the difference between your two lines and seeing just what the difference there is. Now, it's quite possible that your data will look like this, because it took you 2,500 right about there. And then what are we going up to? About 2,700. It took you about 200 milliseconds to do your propositional strategy. On the other hand, if you were rotating it a full 180 degrees before you went to a propositional strategy, your line should be much, much higher, because it would have taken the time that you got to go 180 degrees plus your propositional response time. So that is, I've never heard. So did anybody else stack a propositional strategy on top of an imagery strategy for the different trials? No? Okay. Well, that would be an interesting twist to see if more people kind of do that sort of strategy. That is new to me. But again, that's the kind of reasoning and the kind of thinking and the kind of implications that you can get from data like this. So, what strategy is your mind using? First time I ever heard of the imagery and then stacked on top of it propositional strategies. Although that, I mean, there is some evidence for that. I'm just gonna say this real quick, because this is something that I remember seeing in my grad school. It was one of my favorite talks that I've ever attended. So if you ever read brain imaging studies, they like to use people that are right-handed, right? They'll say like, oh, we found 100 subjects, they were all right-handed. The reason for that is because right-handed people, they have very well organized brains are organized into different functional areas, and every right-handed person has the same organization in the brain. And usually, if you take a look at the left side of the brain, it is rock solid in terms of what it's doing. The difficult side is the right side of the brain. And this talk mentioned that one of the reasons possibly why the right side of the brain is hard to figure out what it's doing is because the right side of your brain uses a lot of its cognitive ability in reserve for when things become difficult. So depending upon how difficult something is, the right side of your brain is going to light up. So if you're an expert chess player and you're playing chess, it's going to be all left side. If you're a novice chess player and you're trying to figure this thing out, your right side is going to start firing. If you're an expert mathematician and you're solving differential equations, all left side. If you're trying to learn how to solve differential equations, the right side of your brain is going to kick in. So this idea of, yeah, we're using one representation, imagery, but then if it gets really difficult, maybe we kick it over to a propositional representation, does have some precedence to it. It's a really, really cool idea. All right, so we got a few more minutes here. So we're going to wrap this up a little bit more stronger than we did here. Just kind of historically, this was really strong evidence, especially that same result that we are actually using imagery representations in our mind. And one of the interesting things about the way that Shepard and Metzler reported it is that if you take a look at that top line there, that top line for the different objects, that is consistent with imagery representation and propositional representation. So maybe it's taking the same time regardless of rotation because we've represented it as a proposition and we're just going down a list of items. Or maybe it takes the same time regardless of rotation because you rotate it through the whole 180 degrees before you finish it. That straight line is consistent with both propositional and imagery representations. The same line, I'm getting easier now. The same line is not. The same line is very strong evidence that we actually do use imagery representations. And I think Shepard and Metzler, perhaps this is just speculation on my part, when they were trying to make their paper as convincing as possible, decided not to graph the same trials, because the same trials were consistent with both. So let's not distract them with the same trials. Let's focus in on what was actually the key finding, which was, I got that backwards again. Don't show them the different trials, show them the same trials, because that's the key finding. Okay. So we're not going to have time to get full into our discussion of consciousness, but we are going to get into that. So I'm going to leave this as an exercise in speculation. Okay. So this is consciousness, as I mentioned before, is literally like the final frontier of our understanding of human psychology. One of the things that makes it very difficult is that we don't even have the proper concepts yet to understand what consciousness is, right? It's hard to even talk about it because we don't have the tools that we need. So imagine trying to use physics, try to understand physics, but nobody has invented the idea of length yet. How could you possibly do physics if you can't even measure how far something has traveled because nobody has come up with that concept? Length is a concept. If nobody invented it yet, we can't use it for cognition. Consciousness is a concept, but we don't have the right framework in order to understand it. So what I'd like you to think about is, think about what our consciousness actually is. Think about how it feels when you are aware of your thoughts, and then that you're aware that you're aware of your thoughts, and that you're aware that you're aware of your thoughts. Consider the simulation hypothesis that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Chuck Nice laid out so nicely for us. And then consider, and this is the final sort of clue, what if our mind actually used an imagery representation and it looked a lot like the Mandelbrot set? So what if our mind used an image that looked like this, and it could zoom in on that representation, much like you can zoom in on an actual image, only to find the same image in that image? What if, when we are representing our mind, we are using an imagery representation of a mind, meaning that we recreate in our mind another mind, that it preserves the same structure? That's the key here. What if, when we represent a mind, because we're thinking that we're thinking, if we represent that by creating another imagery representation of a mind, and if that imagery representation of a mind then creates another imagery representation of a mind, and you go down that wormhole, what might that have to say about consciousness? That is your challenge for the next time. That is where we'll pick up the speculation when we meet again. But other than that, we are done for the day.